This video contains zero flying. What it does contain is a lengthy discussion with my neighbor about formation flying in general. And to the extent that we can, we've included how formation flying might be accomplished most safely with paragliders. I apologize because the audio is not the best, but here you go. So I'm not flying tonight. I'm in my kitchen with my neighbor Jeff. Hey Jeff.
Hey, how's it going?
I told you that this video was coming, and what spurred it on was a couple times that I'd try to fly a little bit of basic formation flight, sharing airspace with other paraglider pilots, and I'm bringing in a subject matter expert tonight. That's Jeff. Jeff, tell me what you can about your credentials, and then we'll talk about some basics about flying.
All right, you bet. Yeah, I'm an Air Force guy. I have about 15 years in the F-16. Went through Air Force pilot training, T-37s, T-38s, so got a lot of the basics down, and then something I've been, kind of applying to my professional life, flying, if you will, since then. So happy to talk about it.
All right, so I'm eating dinner still because Jeff stopped over on a whim and he put his kids to bed, and I've been asking him to do this for a while, so we're gonna discuss it. So, Jeff, what's the single most important thing about flying formation?
Don't hit the other guy.
Exactly. And you know what? Since I've been doing this, I've witnessed 2
Wow.
accidents. Neither of them were intended formation flying. It just happened to be in situations where one was at a fly-in and 2 guys collided.
Yeah.
And, 2 people collided, and the prop from one damaged the flight control system to the other one.
Yikes.
Went down, and unfortunately he was hurt fairly badly, needed surgery to fix things. So, yeah, so let's talk about some basic terminology and some strategies to avoid mid-airs, when particularly the most dangerous thing from my perception is join up or rejoin. If you happen to be out formation flying, one of the things that I see all the time is that nobody designates a flight lead.
Sure.
So, maybe pre-flight briefing.
Yeah.
By consensus, one guy declares himself the lead, or several pilots get together and agree that one guy is the lead, and then he becomes the person that flies a pattern or a formation that everybody else keys on and joins to until such time when we're not flying formation anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously military purposes, tactically speaking, you're going to have a flight lead and his wingman. That might be somebody who's more senior, more experienced, whatever the case may be. But, it translates over well to recreational, any kind of flying purposes. If you're going to have formation, you got to have a flight lead who's kind of the guy, like you said, that everybody else is keying off of and flying formation off of. If you have 2 guys thinking they're flight lead, then you really just have 2 single ship pilots out there that may or may not be working in conjunction with each other. So having the flight lead, and then that guy's generally responsible for what's the plan today. So if there's a planned join up to fly a formation, it's going to be his responsibility to make sure everybody else involved knows what's going on there. The more and more you do it, it might be a more detailed actual brief before you go fly. As you get more experienced at doing that, and guys who have flown together quite a bit, you can kind of designate that flight lead for the day, and you might have more kind of standard contracts between each other. Okay, you're the flight lead today, here's what everybody else is going to do, and it's just understood.
Now, before you and I started talking about this, we briefly discussed some of the concepts that I wanted to convey, and you mentioned this standing contract. Let's talk about that, because what I would kind of like to see happen in the PPG world is guys maybe watch this video, or they discuss this with their buddies that they fly with on weekends, and they say, from now on, let's do it this way. So what kind of things would we typically want to see in that type of a contract, an implied understanding of how vehicle 1 is joined on by vehicle 2? What kind of stuff would you...
Perfect. Probably a little bit different between a fighter aircraft and what you guys are flying, but again, the flight lead kind of sets that, And if you guys wanted to all agree upon some standards, then I would say it's important for the flight lead to be obviously clearing the flight path for the flight, so that other guys aren't as worried about, you know, what are we going to run into. The flight lead's kind of responsible for keeping his eyes down track, because everybody else is going to be keeping their eyes on him to rejoin, fly formation, not run into each other, and maintain a brief formation.
So there needs to be an element of trust.
Exactly, yeah.
The wingmen
Absolutely.
need to say, I'm going to do what Joe Blow lead pilot says.
So the flight lead, yeah, and to build that trust, the flight lead needs to be clear about the expectation and also to fly the parameter that he says he's going to fly. For us, a lot of times that's a certain airspeed for a rejoin. Everybody knows, hey, in an F-16, we're going to rejoin at 300 knots or 350 knots. In a paraglider,
stall protection,
sure,
and maneuverability,
sure,
and some room to accelerate or decelerate and
yep,
stay within those parameters.
So for, you know, translating over to paraglider type flying, that might be a briefed, you know, rate of turn or bank angle or something that flight lead will be a stable and predictable platform that everybody else can now trust. Okay, he's got the overall navigation for this formation. He's looking out, clearing for the flight, and it's my job as the wingman to now keep an eye on him and get to the right parameters to effect a safe and effective rejoin, and, you know, hopefully expeditious as well, because you don't want to spend all day rejoining and
just trying
run
to
out of
get
gas
worked
just
up,
trying to
right?
get, yeah,
Exactly.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
So that kind of goes into, okay, now what is the wingman looking at on that rejoin? And, you know, Air Force-wise, we talk about a couple of just basics that you guys have probably heard of, but your pursuit, your lead pursuit, pure pursuit, lag pursuit.
And I want to specifically define those, because those
Yeah,
are going to be terms that a lot of guys are not familiar with. And the from my understanding, lead pursuit means you're flying to a point where the other guy is going to be.
right. Well, let's start with pure pursuit, because that's probably the easiest for everybody to pick up on. Pure pursuit is I am pointing right at you, and eventually I'm going to get closer to you at a predetermined rate, you know, depending on what airspeeds we're flying, but I'm pointing right at you in pure pursuit, so I'm purely, you know, pointing right at you. Lead pursuit now means I'm going to pull out in lead of you, so my flight path will now be in front of yours, and that's a way to kind of heat up the intercept, if you will, or heat up the rejoin. So if you need to get into formation quicker, you would pull more lead, which would now, you know, get you in there quicker. Or if you see you're coming in too hot and need to slow that down, you would now lag off of instead of pure pointing right at you. So I would lag off of
Fly to a point where
behind
the guy
you.
is already
Yes,
passed.
exactly.
And then therefore you're increasing separation or decreasing your closure rate when you're
right.
too big.
And that's what your pursuit curve, lead lag pure, really is bringing into play. Is it's bringing in your closure rate. So if you need to speed that up, lead. If you need to slow that down, lag. If you kind of like where you're at, maybe pure. The other thing that is going to affect is your aspect, and that's something that probably I never heard talked about much in civilian flying world, and it was not until I kind of got into military stuff that I heard about aspect, which is basically your angle off of the guy that you're trying to rejoin on. So a tail aspect or a zero aspect would be you're directly behind the guy. A 1/8 aspect, you know, 180 degrees out head on would be head aspect there, and then you kind of do the math from there. So for a rejoin, and again, this is for airplane type flying, I think you guys would probably be something similar, but looking at kind of about a 45 degree aspect is pretty normal to see as you're rejoining in, as the flight lead would now have a slight bank into you, and then you're kind of flying right up that 45 degree line off of his tail. Again,
there's some good resources that were filmed back in the 1950s.
For my time.
By the U.S. Navy, and they talk about those angles, and in particular, those propeller-driven airplanes had a lot of angles to measure stuff from. Here's one of the problems that we have, like the F-16. You're sitting out there with not a whole lot of reference to where you're at physically in location to the other guy. So how do you solve those problems where you can't say, okay, my canopy lines up on his rivet line.
Right.
You don't have anything to
Yep.
reference. How do you
So
find
some of it is just experience and learning to eyeball it, honestly, and probably going more conservative until you gain comfort, and then maybe being a little bit more aggressive as you go.
So when we talk about conservative, we're talking about distance off of
Yep.
the other airplane
Yep.
that we're flying.
And it comes back into, looking at another parachute out there, it's kind of tough to say I am exactly 500 feet or 300 feet or whatever, but you kind of know I'm a few hundred feet away or I'm like tens of feet away. And then you're constantly assessing how far away you are with how fast that's changing. So if you're coming in and you're like, this is looking too hot, what we would do in an airplane is we would bail out. So if we had been in pure or lead pursuit to close that distance down, we would now go quickly to lag pursuit, which means you're going to pass behind the guy. And that's kind of your safe out, if you will. If things are looking too hot and you're not comfortable with the rate of closure, then bailing out kind of behind the guy is your safe space.
That's a one pilot decision. That's the wingman.
That's the wingman completely. The flight lead is continuing to be a stable platform.
Stable platform. Which in our case, I'm gonna bring up two things that are not going to translate to the F-16 from the F-16. One of them is flying through the guy's wake behind you has consequences, as it does in the F-16, but
could be a lot worse.
because of the wing collapse potential, it could be significantly worse. So you might even want to add in the element of an altitude change.
Absolutely.
And we just don't have the ability to ride through wake turbulence in these things that you do.
Yeah,
I forget what the other thing was.
Well, that actually brings up a good point of, flying, unlike driving a car, is 3 dimensions, right? So, building in some altitude stack as a further measure of safety, of deconflicting your flight paths is always a good thing. So you can run your intercept, if you will, your rejoin with a slight altitude stack, and then once you get it close enough into where you've solved the angles, the closure rate, and you're comfortable, now you can bump it up into more of a level formation once you've gotten the angular part of it out of the way. So that's great. Another thing that I think is really important to talk about when you talk about not running two aircraft of any kind into each other is line of sight, which I don't know if you guys get into that much, but if I look out at the horizon that's not moving and I see another aircraft of any kind and it's a speck and it's either getting bigger or smaller, probably bigger in this case, but it's not moving at all across the horizon or up or down,
bearing is not changing.
Zero line of sight, you're going to hit it, right?
Of course.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And that could be, if you have a slight converging vector, that could be 180 out, that could be anything. So line of sight's always important. If you see line of sight moving aft of you, you're going to pass in front of him. If you see line of sight moving forward on you, then you're going to pass behind him. So that's another important tool to use in any kind of rejoin, especially when it comes down to you're getting close, and if you have too much overtake, you don't like it, ideally you will want to see some forward line of sight, meaning that you will pass behind, and hopefully in your case low or high with a altitude stack so you don't fly right through the prop wash there.
Well, what I learned very early in flying about wake turbulence was it almost always tended to sink and settle down behind the flight path vector. So for that reason, I'm suggesting that when wingmen or potential wingmen decide to join on the lead, that they maintain a slightly higher altitude.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It can always be adjusted downward once you get in close. Now,
and see, that's kind of opposite, because for us, flying through jet wash in an F-16 case is not as big of a deal. It's still not ideal, but it's not like you're going to fall out of the sky. And for us to see under your nose is tough. So you want to be a little bit low so you can look up and have better visibility. But for you guys, I imagine downward visibility is a lot better than upward visibility. So stacking a little bit high.
Apparently you never saw Top Gun.
Nah.
We gotta have a couple Top Gun jokes.
Only a couple dozen, 100 dozen times.
Apparently you never saw the movie. Anyhow. Well, that's funny stuff. So here's something else. Have you ever considered a situation where you didn't have the thrust range to adjust the speed of one aircraft relative to another as easily, and you had to rely on secondary means of energy management, turning, braking, maybe increased turn, or maybe even S-turning to stay in formation.
To slow down, yeah.
Yeah, those are real issues, because I notice, because I'm heavy, even though I'm flying a bigger glider, typically the wing loading that I fly at is pretty high compared to a lot of the lighter weight guys that are smaller, and they're flying smaller gliders. But when we talk about gliders that are rated, they go through a rating process. The A gliders tend to be slower, lower wing loading gliders, whereas the B and the C and the D and the more advanced gliders are faster, hotter type gliders. And they just don't have the speed range, even if they're trimmable, or even if they can get in and out of reflex mode type wing form management. There's still a lot of disparity between the fastest an A-wing glider can go and sometimes the slowest a B-wing glider can go. And you might not be able to be
compatible.
Out there hang in formation compatibly. And I think certainly you can talk about running intercepts on airspace violators, for instance.
Absolutely,
that are so slow you can barely keep up with them.
Yeah. I mean, I've had to do that real world, go intercept a Cessna 172 that was flying in a TFR that he wasn't supposed to be in, but I can't rejoin and physically fly formation with that guy. So I wind up, I would be stalling out of the sky if I slowed down to 90 knots,
Well, that same thing happens in the paragliders. So, and I've already experienced that, where I just could not slow down anymore to keep up with someone. And it's kind of a deal killer, but there are some tricks that we can use for energy management. One of them is holding a little bit of brakes, and certainly the trim range. And both pilots should be aware of it. A lot of us have the ability to talk to the other pilots. Let's talk about communications in an air-to-air situation or in a formation situation. How much chatter goes on between the lead and the wingman in a typical F-16 sortie, where your mission has been briefed? You're out there, everybody's on profile. I'm guessing that there's not a whole lot of discussion.
So you hit the nail on the head right there with if the mission's been briefed. And for us, obviously, what we're concentrating on is more tactical, who's shooting me, who am I supposed to shoot, that kind of stuff. So more of your communications are mission-based, of situational things that are a lot more dynamic. But the basic formation things, they've been briefed. It's something that everybody's been doing for years in most cases. And there's also a lot of visual signals that we can use. So a rock your wings in an airplane means rejoin on me. We'll have other signals that'll signal a guy to now get away, or kind of detach.
Well, we have some similar things that have become the standard. Pretty much anytime the guy that's out front, the lead in our situation, is going to make a turn, there's some body language indicators before he turns. It's typically he's going to look in the direction that he's going to turn. He's going to weight shift in the direction he's going to turn, which starts a much slower, gentler roll. If that's not an indication that something's about to happen, the wingman's just not qualified to be in that position. And then when he pulls in the brake, then the glider's going to start to change in that direction. So those are some of those non-verbal visual clues that I've seen used. So let's talk about a couple things that might cause us to be able to decrease our spacing to an absolute minimum. I'm talking, airshow pilot minimum, demonstration team pilot minimums, versus times or situations where you would intentionally increase your spacing for both safety or maybe even tactical.
And maneuverability too. You got to figure, if a guy is farther away, then the flight lead can be more dynamic with his maneuvering, because it's not that split second I'm turning into my wingman thing. Whereas if you're in close, kind of demo as you mentioned, now your flight lead needs to be very smooth, very kind of slow and deliberate with any kind of movement he does, so that the wingman, because he's right there, only feet away, needs to have the ability to react to that.
So what about turbulence? What about density, altitude? Those things affect paragliders as well. Increase the spacing.
Yeah.
I guess is the point.
Right. The maneuverability.
Think back to the slowest, least maneuverable vehicle that you flew formation in. Probably the T-37.
T-37, yeah.
What was the typical situation where a two-ship, for instance, takes off, flight of two? One guy gets airborne significantly earlier than the other because of some technical glitch, a checklist problem, air traffic constraints, whatever, and is loitering in the area waiting to be joined on. What would be the flight profile that he would typically fly? And then let's try to maybe come up with a scenario where we would say this will work with PPG, because I have had this happen a couple times. I'm not the best foot launch guy on the planet, and sometimes I'm waiting for weather conditions, or the other pilot may well have been in the air for 15 or 20 minutes.
Right.
I get there, get unpacked, get my motor warmed up, get pre-flighted, and he's waiting for me to come up and join him. So I like to see him in a steady, shallow bank turn, flying a circular pattern. That makes it the easiest for me to climb up to altitude, get on a similar heading, and then use those tools that we talked about before.
Absolutely. So I'd back it up a step even further, is before you even go trying to rejoin, making sure that you see each other. And that can be a factor as well. If one guy gets airborne first and is waiting out there, the other guy, what we'll use a lot of times is altitude deconfliction. Hey, you stay above X altitude, I'll stay below X altitude until we see each other, and then we can signal for a rejoin. Understand you guys taking off, you're probably looking up and see the guy right away, so that may or may not be a huge factor. It could also be kind of a geographic deconfliction. If there's a field you're taking off out of, hey, once you're up there, if you're ahead of me, stay over, east of this road, or stay on this side of this tree line or something like that until I signal that I see you, and then we'll signal for the rejoin. So having that kind of no sight deconfliction game plan, I think, is important. And then, like you said, once you see each other, having a way to, the flight lead take control and signal, okay, it's time to rejoin. Because again, you don't want to try to rejoin on a guy who doesn't know you're there. Then he might do some aggressive maneuver and, give you a face full of parachute that you don't want to see. So having him signal for it. And then, like you said, it's a matter of using the tools that we've talked about. Again, for an airplane, probably getting on like that 45-degree aspect line, and then using your lead lag, airspeed overtake if you have a hotter aircraft than he does speed-wise, but using all those tools to manage your closure. And then something I would say is ultimately important. We've kind of talked a lot about the rejoin itself more than formation flying, but if I could give any advice on that, always having an out. As a flight lead, a good flight lead is always monitoring his wingman, not just devoting 100% of his attention to flying and looking out what's in front of him, although that's probably his primary responsibility, but he's always taking quick looks over his shoulder, making sure that a guy is not about to run into him, and if so, then directing him either by comm or by some visual signal telling him, hey, overshoot, as in, pass behind me, go to lag pursuit, knock off this rejoin. And then going back to the wingman, managing those tools to, I'd say, start conservative, maybe get more aggressive as you gain more experience and comfort with it as far as how quickly you're able to rejoin. But no matter how good you get, always having that out of, okay, if this looks bad in game, where am I going to go with my aircraft? Which it sounds like aft and high in you guys' case is probably one of the preferred places to go, but always having that out in mind. And then if it's not safe and comfortable, then making the decision to overshoot.
The first few times that I flew formation in the general aviation environment, it's a lot different. you know, you don't have ejection seats.
Yeah.
You make a mistake, it's a fatal mistake.
Sure.
Oftentimes.
Yeah.
You know, you damage 2 airplanes. Even if you both get back on the ground safely, you're going to be really lucky if nobody gets hurt, and then the financial consequences of it. So the thing that I remember about my very first attempt to do this in a general aviation airplane was the sun always being in the way, and my instructor was the kind of guy that ensured that we went out early in the morning. And our very first attempt at this was directly into the sun for the purpose to demonstrate that the sun's always going to be there. So the sun is just one of those things you're going to have to deal with.
Absolutely.
You know, it's really nice to take off with the sun behind you and a headwind for takeoff, and then be able to have that light angle that's just perfect.
Yep.
It's not always helpful for the lead.
Right.
It tends to be more of a favored position for the wingman to be able to have the sun on his back. So sun angles are, and the paragliders, you know, we're typically flying them early morning or later in the evenings because it's the smoother conditions,
calmer air,
and less turbulence clouds.
Yeah, I think the sun. The sun. Any kind of environmental condition is always going to be a challenge. You know, on the one hand, you'd like to say be a considerate flight lead and orchestrate your rejoin and formation to where the wingman's not looking into the sun. So flight lead consideration for the wingman is a big deal. But that's not always going to be an option. You might be up against some kind of airspace boundary that you can't go further that way, and you are forced to orchestrate a rejoin with the wingman looking into the sun. So that becomes important for the wingman. Your job is to not hit your flight lead. Your job is to be in formation. If you're unable to do that due to environmentals, you need to move your aircraft, whatever kind of airplane that is, to overshoot, to cease that rejoin, make sure or ensure that you have deconfliction from the flight lead so that you're not going to hit them. And then, you know, you might just have to wait until you're able to do another lap around the pattern and have more favorable environmentals to kind of get that rejoin going again. So I think just not pushing a bad or uncomfortable situation is key. And then for the flight lead, obviously, to not set up a bad or uncomfortable position or situation as much as he's possible, or much as he's able to do that.
I just thought of something. Smoothness.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly flying a stable, easy to join to aircraft. So we're talking about smooth control inputs. We're talking about smooth pitch attitude changes. We're talking about smooth power changes. All of which are going to translate to easier to join.
Absolutely. Yep. I've seen that over years of you know, military flying, that there are some flight leads that it's just you don't want to fly off of because they are binary in their control inputs, both in stick and throttle, and it's a nightmare. Whereas the best guys to fly formation are the guys who, you know, and obviously we're not talking about getting close to the margins of stalling or overspeeding anything, but if you're within the envelope, guys who might just leave the power where it is and accept being a knot or two fast or slow, you know, it's not as precise, but if he's not moving his power around, then the wingman doesn't have to move his power around. And we could talk about, you know, in fighters, you're getting now into a 4-ship where if lead is moving his power, number 2 is moving his power that much more, 3 is really doing it, and poor 4 is just on the end of a whip out there. So it all goes back to, the smoother that the lead is with his control inputs, you know, as well as power adjustments, just the easier it's going to be for everybody else out there.
There are a couple teams out there that have put together air show routines.
Nice.
With paragliders, and they don't tend to do full-on acro in formation. But mostly what I see is that when they get into the acro portion of their routine, it tends to be a big break. So everybody goes in a different direction. There's aerobatics, and then maybe a rejoin or a coordinated pre-planned approach to the field landing type of a scenario. But are there any considerations on on pattern entry in formation, or breaking a formation, maybe?
I'd say, again, it all comes back to the flight lead briefing or setting a contract for knowing what everybody's going to do. So really the last thing you want in any kind of formation is a surprise of somebody doing something unexpected and you winding up with a face full of canopy in your case, or flying right through prop wash or something unexpected. So I would say as long as everybody's on the same page with a briefed plan. I mean, I've never done any kind of air show, kind of demonstration flying, if you will. I've been purely tactical, so it's probably a different set of considerations for that. But just at face value, I would say having a plan that everybody will stick to that is inherently safe and deconflicted from each other is important.
All right, Jeff. I think we've beaten this topic, and we've covered all the major stuff. So you can be my wingman anytime. I mean, where do we go from here?
Yep.
I don't know.
How'd I know you were going to end with that?
Yeah. Right.
Gotcha. So, I'd like to see it if you get a good one.
I had some that I included. The glider speeds were terribly incompatible. And he was a tandem.
Oh yeah.
And you would think that the tandem would be faster because of the higher wing loading.
Right.
But he was using bigger wing.
So he's slowing back down, more drag. Yeah.
And he just couldn't keep up. And you know, we took off about the same time, and I just raced away from him.
Ran away.
I could do. So.
About the only thing you could do there is just stay in a constant circle, and he fly a smaller concentric
Yeah. Well, that's
circle.
That is one way to do it. Is that so much of it comes down to geometry, a good understanding of
Yeah.
of, the fact that for one guy to follow a flight pattern or path, he's going to cover a distance that's different than somebody that uses a.
Yeah. Well, that same example we ran into in Afghanistan, finding the tankers, because you would rejoin on a tanker to get gas, but he is slowed all the way down to 200 knots because he's got some big fat slow A10s on the boom. And the tankers, actually, to their credit, they got really smart about if they had A10s on the boom and they heard F-16s checking in, and we don't want to slow down much past slower than 300, maybe 250 knots at the slowest. So if they heard a F-16 call sign checking on the radio, they would immediately start a 30-degree bank one way or the other. That way the A10 is right there on the boom with them. They could hang at 200 knots, but then we could fly a couple miles outside of that circle at 300 knots and basically stay in formation until the A10s were done. Then they would clear out of the formation and the tanker would speed up for us. So, yeah, the whole concentric circles, faster on the outside, slower on the inside.
I had heard that there were special refueling units that did the SR-71s.
Probably so,
You
yeah.
probably know some of those guys late in their career when you started.
Maybe, yeah.
I remember hearing stories about, in order for the SR to come up, they were at min controllable airspeed to get fuel, and then
the tanker's a red line.
The tanker's a red line, and as they transferred fuel, he had to fly faster. So they started heading downhill.
Yep.
And the tanker almost
call it
gets
the
hit
toboggan.
in the tuck.
Yep.
And they toboggan downhill just
Yep.
to be able to stay in formation. So it can get that complex. I don't really want to get into
I was going to say.
just how complex it can get, because I don't see anybody in a paraglider needing to worry
If you're
about
getting that, complex, then you're probably pushing the boundaries of what you should be doing in a paraglider.
Yeah. All right, man, we're done. That's all I got.
Cool.
That was
That's
fun.
good stuff.
Anyhow, that ends my discussion with Jeff. I had a real nice time getting together with him and discussing some of these concepts on formation flying, and particularly how it may or may not be applicable to 2 or 3 fellows getting together and flying their paramotors in the same airspace. So brief it up, come up with a plan, fly safe, and don't bang into each other. I'll see you at the next fly-in.